The hours passed, and Daniel continued working late into the night. He had completed the update and was confident that everything was fine. He stretched his legs and took a quick break, sipping some coffee to keep his energy up. The bank's systems were vast, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. At least, that's what he thought. However, as the night deepened, strange things started happening. The first sign was subtle, almost unnoticeable. A small notification popped up on his screen, an alert about a minor glitch in one of the bank's financial systems. It wasn't a major issue, but Daniel decided to look into it. He quickly ran a diagnostic test, assuming it would just be a minor glitch caused by the update. He wasn't overly concerned. As the minutes turned into hours, the situation slowly escalated. The alert was followed by another, and then another. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he noticed that they were all linked to the system he had just updated. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The update should have patched any vulnerabilities, not created new ones. Still, Daniel reassured himself. It was probably just a temporary issue, nothing to panic about. But then, more serious problems began to unfold. The bank's internal transaction monitoring system, which kept a close watch on all transfers, started flashing with warnings. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard as his heart rate quickened. Transactions were showing up that didn't belong. Money was being moved, and not in the usual pattern. He quickly opened up the system's logs, hoping to identify where the problem was coming from. His eyes scanned the lines of code and the transaction details, trying to piece it together. That's when he saw it. The numbers. Huge sums of money being transferred from accounts in the blink of an eye. $10 million here, $50 million there. And they were all going to unknown accounts. Panic started to set in. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to figure out how this could have happened. The update was supposed to make everything safer, not cause the system to malfunction. He checked the access logs and found nothing unusual. No unauthorized users, no hacking attempts. Everything appeared clean. Yet, the transfers were happening in real time, and they were happening fast. The enormity of the situation began to hit him. This wasn't a simple glitch anymore. The bank was losing millions, possibly more. He quickly tried to reverse the transfers, but the system was moving too quickly. Every time he tried to stop one transfer, another one would begin. The money was slipping away faster than he could keep up. Daniel's hands were shaking as he tried to regain control, but it was like trying to hold back a flood. No matter what he did, the transactions continued. The warning lights on his screen grew more intense, flashing with urgency. He realized with a sickening feeling in his stomach that he had made a massive mistake. This was no longer just a minor error. It was a full-scale disaster in the making. In that moment, Daniel knew he was in deep trouble. The bank was about to face the kind of crisis that could change everything. The question now was, how long could he stop the bleeding before it was too late? The next few hours felt like a blur. Daniel could hardly believe how quickly things had escalated. Every time he thought they were making progress, something new popped up. The bank's servers were running at full capacity, processing more transactions than they had ever been designed for. Each time the system processed a transaction, it seemed to trigger another, and the money kept disappearing faster than they could keep track. The stress was beginning to take its toll on Daniel. His eyes were bloodshot from staring at the screens, his mind clouded with panic. The room was filled with the sounds of frantic typing, phone calls, and discussions that led nowhere. The senior management team, along with the IT and security experts, were working around the clock, trying to come up with a plan to stop the bleeding. But no one had any answers. The problem seemed to be spreading like wildfire, and every solution they came up with only seemed to make things worse. In the back of Daniel's mind, he kept hearing the same thought. This is all my fault. He had caused this. He had made the mistake, and now the bank was paying the price. His stomach churned with guilt as he thought about the people who trusted the bank, the clients who had their life savings in the system, the employees who relied on the bank for their jobs, and the executives who had put their faith in him. He couldn't help but feel like he had let everyone down. Despite the mounting pressure, Daniel tried to remain focused. He knew that they couldn't afford to waste any more time. Every second counted. He turned to Sarah, his trusted colleague, for guidance. She had been on the phone with external experts and security teams from around the world, but even they were stumped. "We need to stop the system from processing any more transactions," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "If we don't, we're going to lose everything." Daniel nodded in agreement. The problem was, no one knew how to stop the transactions once they had started. The system had been compromised, and the flow of money couldn't be halted without causing even more damage. It was a delicate balance. They needed to stop the bleeding without completely shutting down the entire system. As they worked together, they started to uncover a disturbing truth. The update that Daniel had installed wasn't just a routine patch. It had somehow triggered a vulnerability in the system, one that no one had anticipated. It wasn't just a small mistake. It was a catastrophic flaw that had gone unnoticed in the code. The update had opened a backdoor, one that was now being exploited by an unknown party. But who? And why? The situation was becoming even more dangerous by the minute. Daniel felt a deep sense of dread settle in his chest. The worst part was that they didn't even know how long the transactions had been happening. How much money had already been lost? How much more would disappear before they could stop it? Time was running out, and the tension in the room was unbearable. The bank was on the brink of collapse, and no one had any idea how to stop it. After hours of intense work, Daniel finally felt like they were gaining ground. The changes he had made to the system had slowed the hackers' progress, but it wasn't enough to stop the attack completely. The security team worked tirelessly, patching vulnerabilities and reinforcing the system, but there was still a constant threat lurking in the background. The hacker was still trying to push through, adapting to their defenses with each attempt. Daniel's hands trembled as he sat at his desk, staring at the monitors. The pressure was overwhelming. The bank's future was on the line, and so was his career. He had made the critical mistake of rushing the update. And now, despite his best efforts, he was in a race against time to fix the mess. The weight of his responsibility was heavy on his shoulders, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. He had to keep going. Sarah, his colleague and trusted partner, leaned over his shoulder, watching as the system continued to fight back against the hacker's commands. "We've made progress," she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of urgency. "But we need to act fast. We can't let them gain access to any more of the accounts." Daniel nodded. His mind was spinning with ideas, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. He had learned something crucial about the hackers' method. They were using a highly sophisticated algorithm that could bypass traditional security measures. The only way to beat it was to think outside the box. Suddenly, Daniel had an idea. He quickly ran to the server room, where a small team of its specialists was working. He explained his plan, and they immediately began executing the new strategy. The idea was risky, but it was the best shot they had. If they could create a temporary decoy transaction, they might be able to trick the hacker into revealing their location. Back in the main office, the security team worked quickly to implement the new strategy. Daniel felt a spark of hope. It was a long shot, but it might just be crazy enough to work. He watched as the decoy transaction was set up, and then he held his breath. Would the hacker fall for it? The seconds felt like hours. The screens flickered again, and then something remarkable happened. The hacker's script hesitated. For the first time in hours, the system showed a sign of stability. The decoy transaction had worked. The hacker's algorithm had been tricked into thinking it was still operating as usual, but in reality, it had been redirected to a trap. Daniel watched in awe as the security team quickly isolated the hacker's location. They traced the IP address and successfully locked out the intruder. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was enough to stop the hemorrhaging. The system was secure again, and the money transfers had stopped. The room was filled with sighs of relief as everyone realized what had just happened. It wasn't a perfect outcome, and there were still many questions to answer, but the immediate danger had passed. The bank was safe. For now. Daniel sat back in his chair, exhausted but relieved. He had saved the bank, but the cost of his mistake weighed heavily on him. He knew that the consequences of his actions would follow him for a long time. Still, in that moment, he allowed himself to feel a small sense of pride. Against all odds, he had turned the tide. As the hours ticked by, Daniel felt a sense of urgency he had never experienced before. The clock was ticking, and with each passing minute, the bank's losses were mounting. They had tried everything, from isolating the compromised systems to calling in external experts, but nothing seemed to work. The transactions continued to flow uncontrollably, and Daniel felt as if he was watching the destruction of everything he had worked for. In a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding, Daniel suggested they shut down the entire system. It was a drastic move, but it was the only option left. Sarah and the other security experts agreed that they needed to halt the transfers before the damage became irreparable. They quickly disconnected the servers from the network, hoping that the system would stop processing transactions. But even that didn't work. The bank's mainframe continued to run, the money still disappearing at an alarming rate. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to think of another solution. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the walls lined with monitors, each one showing the same terrifying numbers. It felt like a nightmare that he couldn't escape from. Then, just as Daniel was about to lose hope, a message appeared on his screen. It was from the external security team. They had managed to trace the source of the breach. The message was clear. Someone had exploited the bank's vulnerability remotely, using a sophisticated method to manipulate the system. The hacker had been using a set of complex algorithms to initiate the transfers without leaving a trace. It was a well-planned attack, and the hacker was still active within the system. Daniel's heart sank. The update he had installed wasn't just a mistake. It had been the entry point for a malicious attack. The hacker had found the weakness and used it to drain the bank's accounts. The realization hit Daniel hard. He had unknowingly opened the door to this catastrophe. The security team worked tirelessly to identify the hacker's location and trace the transactions to the source. They managed to track down the remote IP address from which the attacks were originating. It was a breakthrough, but it didn't bring the immediate relief Daniel had hoped for. The hacker was moving too fast, and the system was still compromised. Every attempt to stop the transfers seemed to fail. Meanwhile, the bank's top executives were in crisis mode. The press had caught wind of the issue, and rumors began circulating. The public's trust in the bank was quickly eroding, and the financial markets were reacting negatively. The bank's stock price plummeted, and clients began pulling their money out. The situation was spiraling out of control, and there was no clear way to stop it. Daniel watched all of this unfold, feeling completely helpless. The weight of the disaster was heavy on his shoulders. He had made the wrong decision by rushing the update, and now the consequences were clear. He knew that the bank's reputation, its future, and even his own career were hanging by a thread. As he stared at the monitors, a new determination washed over him. He couldn't give up now. The bank needed him. He had to find a way to stop the hacker and fix the mess he had caused. But with every passing moment, the task seemed more impossible. The situation was now dire. The bank was on the verge of collapse, and no one seemed to have a solution. Every attempt to stop the hacker had failed, and with each new transaction, the bank lost more money. The executives were in constant communication, trying to figure out a way to salvage the situation. But no one had any answers. The hacker was still at large, moving swiftly through the system, and no one knew how to stop the chaos. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him. His mind was racing, his body exhausted from the nonstop pressure. He had been working for hours, without any break, and now everything seemed like a blur. His thoughts were a mixture of guilt and frustration. He had caused this disaster, and now he was failing to fix it. The weight of his mistake felt unbearable, and he wondered if there was any way out of this mess. But as the clock ticked on, Daniel's determination began to resurface. He couldn't give up now, not when so much was at stake. He remembered something one of the senior IT experts had mentioned earlier. The hacker was using a series of automated scripts to control the transfers. If they could disrupt those scripts, they might be able to stop the money from flowing. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only lead they had left. With renewed focus, Daniel started to dig deeper into the system's logs, looking for any clues that might help him understand how the hacker was bypassing the security measures. As he examined the data, something clicked. He found a pattern in the transactions, a flaw in the hacker's code that could be exploited. The hacker had been so focused on manipulating the transfers that they had overlooked a small vulnerability in the way the system handled certain commands. Daniel quickly ran a series of tests, tweaking the system to disrupt the hacker's scripts. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he worked, trying to outpace the hacker. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance. The system was already compromised, and they needed to take bold action if they had any hope of stopping the attack. As Daniel executed the changes, he held his breath. The screen flickered for a moment, and then nothing. The system didn't crash. Instead, for the first time in hours, the transactions slowed down. The flood of money that had been pouring out of the bank's accounts came to a halt. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory. They had bought themselves some time. He quickly alerted Sarah and the rest of the security team, telling them what he had done. The team scrambled to back up Daniel's work and make the necessary adjustments to strengthen the security. The pressure was still immense, but for the first time in hours, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't out of the woods yet, but this small victory was enough to keep them fighting. The hacker hadn't been stopped entirely, but now the bank had a fighting chance. Daniel knew they had to keep pushing forward. They couldn't let the hacker win, not after everything they had worked for. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was starting to turn. The bank had always been known for its rock-solid reputation. It was one of the largest financial institutions in the world, with billions of dollars moving through its systems every single day. Clients trusted the bank with their life savings, investments, and business dealings, and the bank never failed to live up to that trust. The systems were designed to be nearly unbreakable, with security measures that no one could easily bypass. For years, the bank had maintained a flawless record, and that's how everyone liked it. Secure, steady, and above all, dependable. Inside the bank's massive headquarters, teams of workers handled transactions, investments, and all kinds of high-stakes financial activities. But at the heart of this well-oiled machine was a small but incredibly important team: the systems administrators. These were the people who kept the bank's entire digital infrastructure running smoothly. They made sure that the software, networks, and databases were constantly updated, protected, and functioning without fail. Among the administrators was a man named Daniel, a senior systems expert with over 10 years of experience. He was respected by his colleagues, known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. Over the years, he had earned a reputation as someone who could solve any problem that arose. But lately, Daniel had been feeling the pressure. The job had become more demanding than ever, and the deadlines were tighter than before. He spent long hours at the office, often staying late into the night to finish his work. His confidence was unshaken, but deep down, he knew he was starting to get exhausted. One night, Daniel was assigned a task that he had completed countless times before: updating a routine patch for the bank's security system. It was a regular update, something that had been done every few months for years. The procedure was simple enough: apply the patch, reboot the system, and ensure everything was running smoothly. It was a job that could easily be done in a few hours, with minimal disruptions to the day-to-day operations of the bank. There was nothing unusual about it, and Daniel felt that he could get it done quickly, even if he was a little fatigued. He sat down at his desk, eyes glued to the screen. He double-checked the update files, read through the instructions one last time, and prepared to begin. The task seemed so straightforward that he felt there was no reason to overthink it. With a few clicks, the patch was installed. Daniel noticed that the system was running a bit slower than usual, but he figured it was just the reboot process. After all, it had been a long day. But he was wrong. As Daniel sat back in his chair, feeling a brief sense of accomplishment, he didn't realize that his seemingly minor decision to skip over a small security step in the update was about to trigger a series of events that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a decision he made intentionally. It was simply a lapse in focus. But that one tiny oversight, which seemed insignificant at the time, would soon cause chaos beyond anyone's imagination. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the bank's reputation and the trust of its clients would soon be at risk, all because of one careless mistake. As the minutes turned into what felt like hours, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced with a mixture of panic and disbelief. He had never imagined anything like this could happen, especially not after something as simple as an update. Yet here he was, watching in horror as the bank's money vanished right before his eyes. The transfers kept coming, faster and faster, and Daniel's hands shook uncontrollably as he tried everything he could think of to stop them. The more he tried to stop the flow of money, the more he realized how deep the problem ran. The system was spiraling out of control, and he couldn't get a grip on it. The normally calm and methodical Daniel now felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. It was like a fire spreading, and he was too far behind to put it out. He quickly called in the head of the security team, Sarah, hoping she would know what to do. Sarah was sharp, quick-thinking, and had seen plenty of crises in her career, but even she was stunned by what Daniel showed her. She sat down beside him, her face pale as she watched the transactions flood the screen. There was no time to waste. They needed to figure this out fast. "I don't get it," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "This shouldn't be happening." Everything looked fine before the update. Daniel nodded, his mind still racing. He tried to explain everything, but the words felt hollow. "I thought the update was routine," he said, his voice strained. "I've done it before. I double-checked everything. It was supposed to be safe." Sarah didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. The situation was much worse than either of them could have imagined. If the money continued to disappear at this rate, the bank could lose hundreds of millions of dollars in just a few hours. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized the scale of the disaster. Time was running out. They quickly contacted the bank's 8 experts, but no one had an immediate solution. It wasn't long before word of the problem began to spread through the organization. The executives were alerted, and soon, the entire senior management team was involved. Panic set in as they realized what was happening. The bank's reputation, its financial standing, and the trust of its clients were all on the line. The boardroom buzzed with chaos as plans were thrown together. But even the best minds in the room couldn't come up with a clear answer. The more they tried to understand the cause, the more they realized that Daniel's mistake had opened a hole in the system that no one could close fast enough. As the transfers continued to happen in real time, Daniel felt his world collapsing. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of disaster that could end careers and ruin the bank forever. His stomach turned as he thought about the consequences, not just for him, but for everyone else who depended on the bank. There was no going back now. The question that lingered in the air was simple: how could they stop it before the bank lost everything?